Welcome to today's lesson, Living in Our Watershed. We're going to build on some concepts we learned last time in our Is Soil Alive lesson. In our lesson, we're going to learn about how the water cycle affects the landscape. We'll think about ways to prevent water pollution, and we'll learn new words that help us to talk about watersheds. Time for some vocab. Remember, you can always pause and take a moment to write down your vocab words in your garden journal. Our first word is watershed. A watershed is a large area of land where water all drains and collects in one place by way of rivers, and it might collect in lakes and streams. Our next word is a tongue twister, tributary. Say it with me, tributary. Tributaries are small creeks that drain from ridges and they enter a larger river or lake. So in the pictures below, it would be a small creek like the one in the middle, whereas the ones on the side would be larger bodies of water like lakes that are part of the watershed too. Notice that the tributary here is the smaller stream that links up with the larger river. An estuary is where fresh water mixes with salt water as rivers meet the sea. And a bonus word, brackish, means water that's not that salty but not that fresh either. And that always occurs in estuaries. A delta is a piece of land in the shape of a triangle or fan that's made by deposits of mud and sand at the mouth of a river. It's also shown on our picture. The delta in this picture is the greenish, muddy area that looks like it's spitting out from the mouth of the river behind it. Why don't you take a moment to draw a delta and an estuary in your garden journal? What about runoff? Runoff is the water that falls from the sky and then runs off of surfaces and flows down into bodies of water. You can see in our picture that runoff can come from roofs, yards, or even our driveways. I'm sure you've seen when it gets super rainy, how all the water will run down the street and go down into the drain. That's all runoff. Remember our components of soil from last time? Sand, silt, and clay? Well, that relates to permeability, which is the airspace between the particles of those different components that allows water to move slowly or quickly through it. You can see that sand, which has a bigger particle size, allows water to run through it more quickly. That is because there are bigger air spaces between each particle, and that gives the water room to rush through quickly. That's why sand is so permeable, because water flows through it quickly. But clay, with teeny tiny particles, doesn't allow for much room for the water to flow through, so water moves through it really slowly. It is not very permeable. Now let's talk about the water cycle. The water cycle is the continuous journey water takes from the sea to the sky to the land and back to the sea. Water particles in the sky turn into droplets through condensation. Then they make their way back down to Earth through precipitation. That results in runoff down into our bodies of water. Then they make their way back up to the sky through evaporation. And that's the water cycle. Here's an example of our local watershed. Many of our tributaries and streams empty into our Morro Bay estuary. Since there's nearby cities and man-made surfaces like roads and sidewalks have very low permeability, this means when it rains, water runs off the surfaces very quickly. We'll talk more about this in our next lesson, but what do you think water might take with it when it becomes runoff from a road or a city? Now's the time for you to hear from your garden teacher and talk more about our watershed.
Hi kids. It's Mrs. Mary, and I am out here in the garden at Oceano Elementary School, and we are going to do a fun activity that you can do at home as long as you have adult permission. But this is a great activity to demonstrate what it is to be living in our watershed. And what we're going to do today with nothing more than a watering can and a hand fork, we are going to demonstrate how watersheds work and how the larger bodies of water of a watershed are created. All right, are you ready? Here we go. Here's one of our garden beds, and inside the garden bed is a mountain range. And this mountain range has been made by natural forces, volcanic, maybe just pressure building up, and it looks like it's already rained here. But let's see what happens when the rain comes and how that affects our watershed. So there it is raining, and you can see how the water starts to gather. It comes down in little tributaries. There's a good little river happening. And the more rain that happens, the bigger the tributaries, and they all start to come down into a larger body of water, and that would be your lake forming. So when it rains up in the mountains, all that water finds its way downhill. It's called runoff from all the precipitation. So let's take a look at how this runoff has gathered here. Let's step back, and you can see how there are little areas where these tributaries have formed. Right there's one. There's another one right there. There's a nice big one coming down right here. So these would all be called rivers, and then they would come down into a lake. Now, we just learned about particle size in soil. We're not going to get any lakes around our mountain because our mountain is actually made of garden soil. So we have just the right amount of drainage. Now, if this was a clay bottom, then you would definitely have a lake forming here. So it's very interesting to see how these different watersheds develop. Now, what were to happen if, say, somebody was camping up on top of Mount Oceano and they left all their trash up there, and then the rains came? It would travel down the tributary, it would come into the lake, possibly harm the fish there. Eventually, if enough water gathers, that water will continue and go into larger rivers, moving further down and eventually out into the ocean. And that is what we do not want, is to have that trash end up in our ocean. So our next video you're going to find quite interesting, because in that video we have the pollution solution to living in our watershed. So you all study hard, and I'm so glad you got to see my activity, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!
You might have already talked about these questions with your garden teacher, but if you didn't get a chance to finish all of them, make sure to write your answers down in your garden journal. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.